it's 10:15. I'm calling this meeting of the Committee on Taxes to order for Thursday, February 26th. First item of business, we're just doing a little cleanup. We're approving one of our 2025 minutes. So the minutes from May 6th, 2025. Representative Joy, you want to move the minutes from May 6th?
Move them, Madam Chair.
All right, Representative Joy has moved the minutes for May 6th. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. The minutes for May 6th are adopted, and then we're just going to do the one from earlier this week. Representative Joy, do you want to move the minutes of February 25th, 2026 for adoption?
Move the minutes, Madam Chair.
All right, Representative Joy has moved the minutes. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed?
Yeah. Absolutely, I do, actually.
Okay,
Oh,
okay,
Madam Chair,
we'll back up. Sorry. Representative Weiner.
There's an incorrect spelling of my name.
Thank you so much for looking. We apologize. So we're going to amend, I think that's a verbal amendment. And we apologize and hope you don't shed too many tears about the slight. So can we just move them as amended? Did I just amend them?
Yeah.
Oh, I just amended them. Okay, so we're going to move, Representative Joy, would you like to move the February 25th minutes as amended?
So move.
All right, all those in favor of adopting the February 25th minutes as amended, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Waiting for Representative Weiner, we're good. All right. The minutes are adopted. So today we're going to hear from the Legislative Budget Office about the work of the Tax Expenditure Review Commission. Representative Agbaje and Chair Davids are the co-chairs of the commission this year. Representative Smith and Representative Robbins are our other appointees. And the work of the Tax Expenditure Review Commission may not sound exciting to everybody, but it is exciting to many of us. This was something that Chair Marquardt, now Commissioner Marquardt, was very passionate about. It was one of the things that he passed, I think, in his last year serving in the legislature. And, you know, it's really, it constitutes billions of dollars of spending, and it's a part of the budget that doesn't receive a lot of scrutiny. And so we're really excited to be at this point in the process of reviewing tax expenditures, where we're about to, to have some decisions to make. And I'm going to invite the LBO up, but I just briefly want to say that we get to decide what we make of this. We get to decide whether this body of work that members and staff have spent all this time on turns into a report that sits on the shelf, or it's something that we choose to take action on. And so I just would urge members to really pay attention to this, because I don't want this work to be in vain. And I think that, that together we should be systematically taking a look at this area of spending in our budget and seeing whether it achieves what we wanted it to achieve, and whether, when we weigh it against other spending pressures in our budget, this is how we want to spend the people's money. And so I'm really hopeful that, that there's a way that we can, not turn this into something where we battle to a stalemate and do nothing. So with that, welcome to the committee, back to the committee, Carlos Huereca, and welcome Vlad Fleurimond. Please tell me if I said your name wrong. Please introduce yourselves as you get started. There's a presentation in everybody's packets. Welcome to the committee.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members. For the record, my name is Carlos Huereca with the Legislative Budget Office.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members. My name is Vlad Fleurimond, so that was correct. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so Madam Chair, members, so today, as the Chair discussed, we're going to provide an overview of the Tax Expenditure Review Commission's annual legislative report. And so our office is tasked with providing technical assistance and professional assistance to the Commission. And so in that capacity, we're here to present on the report. And So the report itself was submitted February 16th of 2026, and so again, it covers activities of the commission in the calendar year 2025. In addition to the report, we'll also present two evaluations that the commission received, and those two evaluations actually consist of 3 tax expenditures, and a recommendation was acted upon by the commission. So we'll provide those two presentations as well. As it pertains to the annual report, these are the items that we'll cover. So we'll briefly cover the definition of a tax expenditure, some brief background on the commission itself, the contents of the report, and then an overview of those 5 evaluations that the commission heard in 2025. And then Mr. Fleurmont will cover an overview of tax expenditure evaluation, of the landscape of tax expenditure evaluation. So the statutory definition of a tax expenditure is found in Minnesota Statutes 270C.11. And so these policies are sometimes described as spending through the tax code. You might hear these policies described as preferential treatment to a certain group or certain tax-paying entities. And so essentially these are policies written into law that the legislature has decided to forego on what would otherwise be considered potential state revenue under a structural reference tax structure. And so I would just reference members to the 2024 tax expenditure budget that's published by the Department of Revenue that catalogs the tax expenditures that are being utilized throughout the state. And so in the 2024 report, there was 327 tax expenditures, and I believe a new iteration of that report will come out later this year, if I'm not mistaken. So, with regard to the commission, just some background. So, the commission is asked to review the state's tax expenditures and to determine whether they're performing as intended. And so, to do that, the commission essentially provides 2 reviews: an initial review and then an evaluation. So, we'll go into more detail of what that means in a little bit. The commission was created in 2021 and was first convened in 2022. And then every year, the commission must provide a legislative report summarizing its activities in that calendar year. So as to those 2 reviews, the first is an initial review. And so the commission, through the initial review, will establish an objective. And so that process has changed over time, but that's what consists of the initial review is identifying an objective, and potential metrics to measure the tax expenditure against can also be a part of that initial review. The second review is an evaluation, and there's 9 criteria that are outlined in statutes, and that must be included in the evaluation. And so these pertain to issues of effectiveness, efficiency, incidence, in terms of like who pays for the tax in the end, a calculation of a revenue neutral rate and comparisons to similar policies within the state, but also across the country. And so perhaps the most notable of these components is the 9th component, which is a recommendation to the legislature to either continue, repeal, or modify tax expenditure. Okay, and then just some context there. As I've mentioned already, the LBO provides some assistance to the commission. The Department of Revenue provides data and analysis as well. And the LBO may contract with outside parties to conduct evaluations. Last item I'll touch on in terms of overview is just the complement of the commission that's on the slide here. So 9 members, 4 from the House, 4 from the Senate, and then the Department of Revenue, the Commissioner of the Department of Revenue. And so these members will serve until the beginning of next session, 2027. Okay, now to the actual report. So to summarize the activities of the commission met 3 times in 2025, and 5 evaluations were presented to the commission, which encompass 15 tax expenditures in total. And additionally, the commission did adopt procedures to formally produce recommendations to the legislature. Excuse me. And so the commission produced recommendations in January of 2026. And so those recommendations will actually formally be included in next year's annual report, but we'll just discuss them today. Okay, So the report itself provides an overview of the commission, just in more detail to what I just provided. Also, a more thorough summary of each meeting, and again, an overview of the tax expenditure evaluation landscape. And so again, Mr. Fleuerman will provide that overview to supplement the presentation here. And then in the appendices, you'll find that the report does include those 5 tax expenditure evaluations in full. So apologies, it's a large report, but that's largely why. Okay, so I'll also mention those 15 tax expenditures. There's a list included at the end of these, at the appendices of these slides. So if folks want to reference those 15 tax expenditures, they're in the slide deck. So those 5 tax expenditures that were presented to the commission include a standalone evaluation of the marriage credit. So we'll cover that in a little bit. And then an evaluation of 2 sales tax exemptions, which pertain to solar energy systems and wind energy conversion systems. So those are 2 separate evaluations that were bundled into one. Sorry, 2 separate tax exemptions that were bundled into one evaluation. The third evaluation is another bundle of 3 credits to small alcohol producers. So 1 for small brewers, 1 for small wineries, and 1 for micro distilleries. The fourth evaluation was a bundle of 6 lawful gambling tax expenditures. And the fifth evaluation was a bundle of 3 exemptions from the sales and use tax, which applied to residential heating fuels, residential water services, and sewer services. Okay, and so in this presentation, we have an overview of those 5 evaluations. I'm going to skip over the slides of the marriage credit and the solar energy system, since we'll provide a fuller presentation on those. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to skip over these next several slides. And so I'll stop at this slide. The marriage credit, the wind energy conversion systems, and the solar energy systems are those that did receive a recommendation. And so in all 3 cases, the commission voted to modify those policies. So because they'll be included in next year's report, there will be more detail forthcoming that can summarize the recommendation, but also member discussion that took place. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Mr. Fleuerman, to cover the alcohol bundle, an overview of that, and further.
So thank you. For the record, again, my name is Vlad Fleuerman, and I'm an economist with the LBO. As my colleague just mentioned, I will provide a high-level overview of 3 tax expenditures that the LBO presented to TERC in 2025. And second, I will provide a high-level overview of the landscape of tax expenditure evaluations. So the TERC presented an evaluation on 3 tax credits for smaller alcohol producers in Minnesota, specifically for small brewers, micro distilleries, and wineries. So those 3 tax credits, they share the same objective statement, which is to promote the development and survivorship of small brewers, micro distilleries, and wineries in Minnesota. So the credit for small brewers was enacted in 1985. The credit for small winery was enacted in 2017. And the credit for micro distillery was enacted in 2014. So collectively, the Minnesota Department of Revenue estimated the total amount of foregone revenue of those 3 tax credits to be $2.4 million in fiscal year 2026. So to evaluate the 3 objective statements in the previous slide, so the LBO relies on a multitude of data sets, such as data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. The LBO relies on licensure data from the Minnesota Department of Public Safety. The LBO relies on licensure data from other states, as well as a small survey that the LBO administered to smaller alcohol producers in Minnesota. So looking at the evidence overall, the LBO concluded that those 3 tax credits likely contribute to the development and survivorship of small alcohol producers in Minnesota, but the extent to which that they do so remain undetermined. And as a reminder, as my colleague just mentioned, the commission has not yet made a recommendation on this evaluation. Next, the LBO also presented an evaluation related to gambling, but it's to 6 tax exemptions. So 4 of those are exclusions and 1 is a tax exemption. So the 4 exclusions and the 1 exemption, so they share the same objective statement, which is to simplify compliance with and enforcement of lawful gambling and reduce administrative burden. And there was another one, which is a credit for certain WIFOs. So that has a different objective statement, which is to use the proceeds to fight poverty, homelessness, and disability. So the 5 of those 6 tax expenditures were enacted between 1984 and 1986, and the credit for certain WIFOs was enacted in 2000. So collectively, the Minnesota Department of Revenue estimated the total amount of foregone revenue of these 6 tax expenditures to be $3.5 million in fiscal year 2026. And again, to evaluate the objective statement of those 6 tax expenditures, so the LBO relies on materials from nonpartisan legal research. The LBO relies on the annual report of the Gambling Control Board, and the LBO also conducted and interviewed with folks at the Gambling Control Board. And also the LBO relies on data from the UR, so summary data and tax data from the UR. So overall, the LBO found that those 4 gambling tax exclusions and 1 gambling tax exemption likely meet their objective of simplifying compliance with and enforcement of lawful gambling and also reduce administrative burden. And the credit for certain WIFO, which has another objective statement, so the LBO concluded that that credit likely meets its stated objective based on the requirements to receive the credit or to claim it, as all net proceeds must be used exclusively to fight poverty, homelessness, physical and mental disability. And again, as a reminder, the commission has not yet made a recommendation on this evaluation. Next, the LBO also presented a tax evaluation related to heating fuels and utility services. So those are 3 exemptions which share the same objective statement, which is to reduce tax burden for low-income households. And the tax exemption for residential heating fuel was enacted in 1978, later expanded in 1984 to include hot water. And then the tax exemption for residential water services was enacted in 1979. And collectively, the Minnesota Department of Revenue estimated the amount of foregone revenue of these 3 tax expenditures to be $344 million in fiscal year 2026. So that's a relatively big number, so $344 million. So to evaluate those 3 tax expenditures, so the LBO relied on the 2024 tax incidence report from the Minnesota Department of Revenue, and the LBO also relies on income summary and tax data from the UR. So overall, the LBO found that these 3 tax credits reduce the regressivity of sales tax and use tax, therefore alleviating tax burden on low-income households. Household making less than $25,000 save on average about $68, and household making above $127,000 save on average $183 on those 3 tax credits. Again, as a reminder, so the commission has not yet made a recommendation on this evaluation. And now, Madam Chair and members, so having highlighted those 3 tax expenditures, so with your permission, I will take a brief pause just in case anyone has any questions before I continue.
Oh, Representative Lee.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I was just going to ask if we were going to hold questions till later. But I have a question about the heating fuels and utility service evaluation findings. So right where we are, Can you, I think I heard you say that this expenditure was enacted in 1979. Is that the right year?
Yes.
Mr. Fleurimond.
Yes, Madam Chair, members, yes, so those are three tax exemptions. So one was the heating fuel was enacted in 1978 and later expanded in 1984 to include hot water. And then the one for water services was enacted in 1979.
Representative Lee?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just want to better understand these three expenditures, and wanted you to explain maybe the fourth bullet you had that, you know, on average, these households making less than $25,000 saved $68, while it is, looks like almost 3 times as much for families making 3 times as much. So is that just proportional, or can you explain that?
Mr. Fleurimond.
Yes, Madam Chair, members, yes, so for that tax expenditure, so we work with the Minnesota Department of Revenue, where they were able to do a simulation for us. So if you were to repeal, for example, those 3 tax expenditures, so what would happen? And then they give us the data by income deciles. So for example, so household making less than $25,000 would save $68. And household making above $127,000 would save on average $183. So, for example, we say that that tax credit reduces regressivity because the $68 is a higher share for lower income households than the $183 for higher income households.
Representative Lee?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I mean, to me, it seems like there is kind of some uniformity, right? Like if you make 3 times as much, it seems like, you know, your savings is 3 times as much. But I'm curious if, you know, if there's insight, and I don't know if this is a question more for some of our nonpartisan staff here, you know, in the late 80s, or it seems like early 80s, late 70s, you know, when we were enacting these expenditures, like, is this the kind of uniformity that, you know, the legislature was intending?
I'm not sure who wants to take a shot at that, if anybody.
Yeah, Madam Chair, members, I don't know that we would have the answer to that. You know, as part of the initial review, we do look at, as much as we can, the legislative record. I don't know that we've noted anything to that particular question. We could take a look at it if you'd like and try and get back to you on that, but we wouldn't know that right now.
Okay.
Thank you. Representative Lee?
Yeah, no, I'm good. Yeah, would love for the answer if someone could research more. Yeah.
Excellent. Representative Wiener?
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is similar to Representative Lee's. The number on the surface here seems to indicate some things, but without all of the information, and I guess that's what I would be looking for, is number of people in the household. Is there a breakdown of rural versus urban? Are we comparing the 7-county metro versus outstate? How are those numbers derived? When we just compare household and the savings per each, yes, it looks skewed, but without all of the information, how do we make an accurate estimate of what's going on? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative Wiener. Mr. Huerta?
Yeah, Madam Chair and members, as part of the follow-up from the commission, we did provide a regional breakdown of specific to Xcel Energy. They provided a breakdown of median utilization for electricity and gas customers. That was only specific to Xcel, but we can provide that follow-up information as well.
Thank you. Anything further, Representative Wiener? Thank you. Oh, so we're going to move on to like another, the landscape, right? So I guess I just have a couple of comments or that I found interesting. So just going back to it is in the alcohol bundle evaluation findings. It just occurred to me because there's this final bullet point, the pages aren't numbered, but it's in the findings. The estimated amount of tax revenue foregone by the state is more than the estimated economic impact attributed to the tax credits. So that's, to me, like, that stood out because it's it's a very clear, you know, kind of statement about the return on investment of public dollars that we get, and in terms of economic output. And then, like, you know, so it just kind of points back to the importance, I think, of the objective statements, because when you talk about like, you know, the objective statement here being promoting development and survivorship, that's maybe something that is easier to measure potentially than, you know, like simplifying compliance and reducing administrative burden as something that we're trying to do through the tax code. I just think that it kind of highlights just some of the ways that we should be thinking about these investments of public dollars. So that's one thing. And so, you know, as we're thinking about how to structure these evaluations, because we are still in a place where we have influence on it, I just want us all to remember this sort of very clear statement about return on investment of public dollars that we have with, you know, this evaluation of the alcohol bundle, for example. The other thing that I would say that I found interesting was in the heating fuels and utility services. So one of the objective statement is about lessening the effective tax burden of low-income households and reducing the regressivity of the sales and use tax. And as we all know from the tax incidence study, the sales tax is just inherently the most regressive tax that we have. And so, of course, any kind of an intervention like this where, you know, a family making $25K gets $68 and a household making 5 times that saves 3 times as much money, that will just inherently increase the progressivity of what is a deeply regressive tax. But I think that the other thing that we need to think about as policymakers is to say, if we were looking to lessen the, well, you're right, I mean, lessen the effective tax burden of lower income households, reduce the regressivity of the sales and use tax, and I would add, make sure that families can heat their homes, right? Like, or something like that. Is this the way that we would spend $344 million a year, $700 million a biennium? Is this the tool that we would use if we were intentionally designing a tax intervention to achieve these outcomes? Because that's a lot of money. You know, what could you do with $700 million to help low-income families across the state heat their homes? Well, if you looked at LIHEAP, for example, which I'm not an expert on or anything, but if you looked at, you know, really targeted interventions for low-income households, those people making $125K probably wouldn't get the $168 benefit, but maybe you would get closer to achieving the goal. So I apologize for going on. I get excited about tax expenditures, but there's a lot of really interesting things, and I'm gonna say it again, but, you know, this, even just in seeing this presentation so far, and the thoroughness of this report that you sent to the legislature, it just really speaks to the quality of the work and the amount of just, you know, incredibly good and important public policy work that the Legislative Budget Office puts into this process. And I just speak for the entire committee and say that we're very grateful to you for just the thoroughness and the dedication to this sort of like niche thing, but it's very important. So thank you. Sorry, I'll keep my comments. I'll stop editorializing now. Please, Mr. Fleurimont.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So now with respect to the landscape of tax expenditure evaluations, so the rationale for including these 11 pages into the report is that at the LBO we are relatively new to the process of conducting tax expenditure evaluations. So we wanted to survey how other entities are evaluating their tax expenditure so that we can leverage best practices to improve our work on behalf of the Commission. So, and then by other entities, I mean entities at the federal level in the U.S., or at the state level in the U.S., or at the international level with respect to other countries. So with that said, I will briefly talk about tax expenditure evaluations at the federal level in the U.S., the state level, international level, and I will conclude with our own practices at the LBO. So first, the federal level in the U.S. So as you all know, there are hundreds of tax expenditure evaluations. Just to cite a couple of them, there are federal tax expenditures related to mortgage interest deduction, various tax expenditures related to retirement accounts, charitable contributions, student loans, you name it. Also, one interrogation that someone might have about those federal tax expenditures is how do they evaluate them? So how do they know, for example, that they work, etc. And so at the federal level, there is not a federal entity or agency that's responsible to conduct tax expenditure evaluations, but the Congressional Research Service periodically publishes a compendium of federal tax expenditures for the U.S. Senate Budget Committee. So the Congressional Research Service provides a balanced assessment of the federal tax expenditures based on research papers and studies by independent economists and researchers. So the goal of the LBO in the coming months and years is to look at some of the techniques and approaches that they use in those studies so that we can improve our work on behalf of the Commission. And then next, we should look at evaluation practices at the international level. Some countries use tax expenditures. So tax expenditures, according to the International Monetary Fund, are ubiquitous and often sizable. They are estimated to reduce tax revenues by an average of 4% of GDP among countries that report on them. So countries have a needs to evaluate their tax expenditures. So to assist countries in this task, international institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, so they have provided guidelines and detailed guidelines for how countries should conduct tax expenditure evaluations. So again, in the coming months and years, so the task of the LBO is to look at some key lessons that we can learn from those guidelines to improve our work on behalf of TERC. Third, we look at tax expenditure evaluation practices at the state level in the US. At least 26 states have laws in the books mandating tax expenditure evaluations. And tax expenditures reduce state revenues by more than $1 trillion in 2021. So that's a lot of money. So states have a need again to evaluate tax expenditures. And to assist them in this task, so different states have different institutional arrangements. So in some states, the legislative offices are responsible to conduct tax expenditure evaluations. In some other states, that falls under the purview of the Department of Revenues. A state of like Georgia, which we work with on an evaluation of a data center, so they have an interesting arrangement where tax expenditure evaluations are the responsibilities of 3 state universities. And then some other states, for example, have contracted outside entities to evaluate their tax expenditures. So when we looked at practices from other states, so 2 key tools that they use are REMI and Implan. So those are software packages that are useful, for example, to evaluate tax expenditures that have to do with tax expenditures, let's say, whose objectives have to do with creating jobs. So those tools can be useful in looking at, for example, the number of jobs created by a certain tax expenditure. And finally, we look at our own practices at the LBO. So one question that we ask is, how do we compare with other states in the work that we're doing? Like other states, we face data challenges. As mentioned, for example, some of those tax expenditures were enacted back in the days, in 1978, for the heating fuel. So sometimes it's very difficult to get data that goes that far back. But overall, our approaches at the LBO are broadly similar to what other states are doing, and we intend to incorporate some of those lessons that we learn from looking at evaluation practices from other institutions. So that was a high-level review of tax expenditure evaluations from other entities. And so with that said, Madam Chair and members, I just want to express a note of appreciation on behalf of the LBO to our non-partisan colleagues in the House and Fiscal Services, as well as the Tax Research Division at the Department of Revenue, for the tremendous help that they have provided to our offices in support of the work that TERC is doing. So thank you, and we are happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fleurimont. Mr. Whittaker, are there any questions before we move to the next part of the presentation? All right, not seeing any. Thank you so much. And it's truly a group effort, as we know, so obviously a lot of work by our nonpartisan staff and the Tax Budget Research Office at the Department of Revenue also went into this, so thank you so much. All right, I think, Mr. Whittaker, you're staying up there and being joined by Alyssa Holterman. Please,
So,
please just introduce yourself before you go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair and members, my name is Alyssa Holterman-Rosas, also with the LBO. I will be walking us through the first part of the presentation on the marriage credit evaluation, and then Mr. Whittaker will cover each of the 9 components of review in more detail. I'll note that if members are looking at the annual report, the full marriage credit evaluation can be found in Appendix F. I will also note that our analysis of claims for this evaluation is based on data provided by the Department of Revenue for 2021 Minnesota taxes. The Schedule M1MA form used in our analysis was from 2023, and the latest claims estimate and estimates of foregone revenue are from the 2024 tax expenditure budget. So this is our agenda for the presentation of the marriage credit evaluation. We will start with the approved tax expenditure objective and then go over some background information on both the credit itself and our evaluation. We will summarize the evaluation findings and then walk through each of the 9 statutorily required components of review individually. So on this slide, you'll see the tax expenditure objective statement approved and adopted by the Tax Expenditure Review Commission on March 15th of 2024. The objective of the marriage credit is to reduce marriage penalties resulting from Minnesota income tax rate brackets for qualified 2-earner married couples who file a joint return. The marriage credit was enacted in 1999. It is a non-refundable credit available only to joint filers, and it applies to resident and non-resident filers alike. The credit is designed the credit is designed to compensate for the increased tax liability experienced by couples who file their income taxes jointly. This increased tax liability is referred to as a marriage penalty. The marriage penalty occurs when one or both filers have some portion of their income taxed at a higher rate when they file jointly than they would if they filed as a single filer. Each individual's income remains the same, however, the combined income of a couple filing jointly is what is used to determine the joint tax liability. Given Minnesota's progressive income tax structure, one or both individuals may be in a higher income tax bracket when they file jointly. The credit is claimed via one of 2 calculations determined by the income of the lesser earning spouse using Form M1MA. I will discuss how and when the penalty occurs in more detail in just a moment. The latest claims estimate from the 2024 DOR tax expenditure budget is from tax year 2023, when there were 422,200 claims of the marriage credit, and the maximum credit in 2024 was $1,801. So on this slide, you'll see the 2023 Minnesota income tax brackets for single filers in the table on the left, and then married filing jointly filers in the table on the right. If we imagine 2 single filers, each with a taxable income of $90,000 after the standard deduction, when they file as single, each individual has a marginal tax rate of 6.8%. Now imagine those 2 tax filers get married and they file their income taxes jointly, and they then have a combined taxable income of $180,000 after the standard deduction. Now their marginal tax rate is 7.85%. So this means that a portion of each individual's income is taxed at a higher rate than it is when they file as single. This increased tax liability is their marriage penalty, and the state's answer to the marriage penalty is the marriage credit. The goal of our evaluation was to determine whether the marriage credit does in fact address the marriage penalty for Minnesota filers. What follow on the next two slides are examples of the marriage credit that will illustrate its mechanics and some of the outcomes of those mechanics. All of the examples will use 2023 tax rates and calculations, and the examples are meant to illustrate how the M1MA form is used to calculate the marriage credit, and some instances in which that calculation results in a credit that does not equal the marriage penalty experienced by that couple. So in the first example, we have taxpayer A with $40,000 in taxable income. They marry taxpayer B, who has $45,000 in taxable income. The couple has no dependents, and they take the standard deduction, so their combined joint taxable income is $57,350. Because the lesser earning spouse, taxpayer A, earns less than $114,000, the couple uses the Schedule M1MA lookup table, which is required by statute. Using this lookup table, they receive a $146 marriage credit. However, if they were to use the calculation in Part 2 of the M1MA form, which exactly calculates the marriage penalty and thus results in a credit that exactly equals that penalty, they would receive a marriage credit of $178. Thus, the lookup table results in a $32 underpayment of the credit for this couple relative to their penalty. This happens because the lookup table uses the midpoint of a range of incomes to calculate the credit rather than the exact income of the filer. So as you'll see in example 2, the use of the lookup table can also result in an overpayment or a marriage bonus. Taxpayers A and B in this example are married with no dependents and take the standard deduction. Taxpayer A has a taxable income of $35,000. Taxpayer B has a taxable income of $38,000. Their joint taxable income after the standard deduction is $45,350. Using the required lookup table in Part 1 of Schedule M1MA, their marriage credit is $106. However, as calculated in Part 2, their actual marriage penalty is only $21. So the required use of the lookup table results in an overpayment of $85 to this couple relative to their penalty. So on this slide, you'll see an overview summary of our evaluation findings for the marriage credit. We conclude that for 59% of filers, the marriage credit matches the marriage penalty. According to analysis by the Department of Revenue of those remaining filers for whom their credit does not match their penalty, approximately 51.5% receive a net marriage bonus or overpayment of the credit relative to their penalty, and 48.5% receive a net marriage penalty or underpayment of their credit relative to their penalty. The total statewide cumulative impact of these under and overpayments is $139,720 in marriage penalties or underpayments to filers. Options for addressing effectiveness of the credit will be addressed by my colleague in component of review number 5. The evaluation also found that the non-refundability of the credit means that couples who have their tax liability reduced to zero through this and other credits and deductions may not receive the full benefit of the credit. So I will pause there for questions, otherwise I will turn it over to Mr. Wareka.
Representative Lee?
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to go back to, I guess, bullet 3, the cumulative impact. Is there a way you can break that down into like overpayments and underpayments?
Yep, I think, sorry, Madam Chair and Representative Lee, I think Mr. Wareka has that on a slide.
Okay.
Otherwise, we will definitely get that to you.
Okay, great, thank you. Anybody else? Okay. So just this final point, non-refundability means some couples do not realize the full benefit of the credit. I mean, but that means that if they're not benefiting from the credit, then their tax liability is zero? Sorry, Ms. Holterman Rosas, excuse me.
Madam Chair, yes, that's correct. So if their tax liability is completely reduced to zero, they're not getting a refund of the value of their credit in that situation.
Okay, thank you for that.
Of course.
Go ahead.
Okay, so Madam Chair, members, again, for the record, my name is Carlos Huereca. So I'll just go into more detail to those 9 components of review that are required. So the first component of review requires an estimate of annual revenue loss. And so the numbers that you see on the screen here are the same that you would find in the tax expenditure budget that was published in 2024. So you'll just note that in fiscal year 2026, the estimated fiscal impact of this tax expenditure is $107 million, $107,300,000. The second component of review is an objective of the tax expenditure, and so my colleague already covered this item. I'll just mention again, the commission approved and adopted the objective in March 15th of 2024 for the purposes of evaluating the marriage credit. Then the third component requires an assessment of impact and efficiency. And so the marriage credit is found to be effective at compensating for marriage penalty for couples whose lesser earning spouse makes at least $114,000. And we'll get into more detail about that. So for married couples in which the lesser earning spouse makes less than $114,000, the marriage credit is less effective. So to understand impact and efficiency, we looked at income sample data at an aggregated level. The sample data available to us at the time, again, is from tax year 2021. And based on this sample data, it was estimated that there were 426,974 claims for the marriage credit in 2021. So my colleague described the process of calculating the marriage credit into sample cases using the M1MA form. So in the course of our evaluation, we conducted the same exercise under 75 different hypothetical married couples that are filing jointly under various income levels. And of those 75 scenarios, there were 62 instances where the hypothetical couple was directed to that lookup table to calculate the marriage credit. And so that would be, again, couples whose lesser earning income makes less than $114,000.
Sorry, so this, is that saying that this is, it's only effective or most effective for people making $230,000 MFJ?
So for couples whose lesser earning income spouse makes over $114,000, they're directed by that M1MA form to go on to part 2 of the form, which spells out an exact calculation of the credit, of the penalty, and then the credit is equally matched to that penalty. For couples whose lesser earning spouse makes less than $114,000, they're directed to part 1, which is a lookup table. And so I'll describe why there's inefficiencies in that lookup table.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
And so of those 75 scenarios, 62 instances where couples were directed to that lookup table, and we found 24 cases where that hypothetical couple received a credit that was either higher or lower than the actual penalty. And there was a range there of at least $10, either higher or lower by $10. The range of difference, however, could be an overpayment of $105 to an underpayment of just over $104. So we did confer with the Department of Revenue's tax research on these discrepancies, and it was described to us that it's because of the use of a lookup table, which is designed based on the midpoint for the credit at each income range, and that can lead to overpayments and underpayments, and so that's the source of some of these inefficiencies that we're describing. So Tax Research Division provided an estimate of 175,161 cases where credit calculations differ by 50 cents or more in that 2021 sample data. So underpayments are estimated at $636,383, while overpayments are estimated at $496,663. And so the cumulative impact of these is $139,720 in underpayments. And so there's more detail on the estimates of underpayments and overpayments on page 17 of the report. And I apologize because we put these in the appendix. The numbers are a little different, but the details in the report. Okay, and I'll just move on here. So then another note with respect to efficiency, we tried to address administrative efficiency. And so our office determined that this credit is somewhat burdensome to claim if a couple is submitting a paper income tax filing. This is based on the number of lines required by that M1 MA form to determine eligibility, let alone the possibility of having to cross-reference up to 5 other line items on one's federal tax filing forms. And again, that's just to determine eligibility. Additionally, there's the fact that there are 2 calculation methods to determine a tax credit amount. That alone can create some confusion. Once a couple is directed to one of the 2 calculation methods, if directed to part 1, the 2 axes on the lookup table are nuanced enough that it could create some confusion. If directed to skip over to part 2, there's 10 steps to calculate that penalty amount. And then once that penalty amount is calculated, you have to use that amount and put that on Schedule M1C to claim non-refundable credits. And then you use the total from that form and use that on the N1 form. And so the message I'm trying to convey is that there's a lot of steps here which can introduce a lot of potential for error. But again, I'll stress that this is the case. This is not the case for electronic filers. This is the case for paper filers. And so that's about 6% of the tax filing population. And of that 6%, 80% of those returns were software generated, and just under 20% were not software generated. So that's a small percentage of folks filing on paper. The fourth component of review is a comparison to direct expenditure with the same purpose. And so this analysis was not performed because a program does not exist. And so this policy is not necessarily meant to encourage a certain type of behavior or activity. It's really trying to address a math problem that is created because of the graduated tax structure of the state. So this analysis was not performed. The fifth component requires these evaluations to identify potential modifications that could make these policies more efficient or effective. And so in further discussions with the Department of Revenue's Tax Research Division, 2 potential modifications were identified to help mitigate inefficiencies of the tax credits calculation that result from that lookup table. And so one alternative would be to repeal the requirement on the Commissioner of Revenue to produce a lookup table on this form, and then require that all filers use the calculation method outlined in Part 2, which again calculates to the exact amount of the marriage penalty, and so the credit is equal to that penalty. The second alternative that was included in the report is to modify the lookup table to allow for finer income ranges. And so the idea there is that it would reduce the variances from the midpoint, and so then reduce the inefficiencies. The sixth component of review is to produce a revenue-neutral tax rate. And so the Department of Revenue completed these calculations and published them in the 2024 tax expenditure budget. And so to offset the cost of the marriage penalty, income tax rates for married joint filers could be reduced by 0.45 percentage points. In the case of this tax expenditure, it's worth noting that reducing the tax rate would not necessarily eliminate the occurrence of increased tax liabilities that result from filing taxes jointly. So again, this is a function of the graduated tax structure. It's a math problem that results from that. It's not necessarily trying to direct the use of or the consumption of a particular good or service. So that's not the case in this situation. So that analysis is not quite relevant in this case. Okay, the seventh component of review requires an analysis of the incidence of the tax expenditure and its impact on the state tax system. And that's in the cases where tax expenditure is considered to be a significant tax expenditure, which is outlined in statutes. But to that end, the 2024 tax expenditure budget does provide the incidence of the tax expenditure by population decile. And so just as a reminder, population deciles rank household incomes into 10 equal segments. Each segment contains the same number of Minnesota households. The first segment is those households with the lowest household income. The 10th decile is those households with the highest household income. And so the occurrence of the marriage credit is calculated for each decile. And so what we find is that 94% of the credit goes to households in the top 3 earning population deciles. And so if you put this another way, these households are simply more impacted by that graduated tax structure. And so they're more likely to be impacted heavily by a marriage penalty. The Department of Revenue also provides a suits index, which is a measure of the policy's progressivity or regressivity. The suits index was calculated at 0.088, which would indicate that as you go up the income spectrum, the proportion of benefit received to total income reduces. So as you go higher in income, the benefit reduces as a proportion of your income. Okay. The eighth component of review is an analysis of cumulative impacts of federal and state policies aimed to address a similar activity. So at the federal level, most tax brackets are doubled for joint filers, and so that does address the issue of a marriage penalty. However, it introduces a higher likelihood of a marriage bonus. And so cumulatively, Minnesotans actually benefit from a marriage bonus at the federal level. However, it's important to note that the same Minnesotans who experience a marriage penalty are not necessarily the same Minnesotans who experience a marriage penalty at the state level are not necessarily the same Minnesotans who receive a marriage bonus at the federal level. And so this is a case for about 191,200 returns. Okay, and so on to the last component here is the recommendation to the legislature. And so as we mentioned already, the commission did vote to recommend that this tax expenditure be modified. And more detail will be forthcoming. And any member questions to discussion, I would likely then defer to Chair Bajé or Chair Davids or any other members on the commission.
Great. Thank you so much. Are there questions or comments from anyone on this section? All right. Oh, sorry, Representative Lee.
Oh, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to provide some context if members are interested. If you go to component review number 7, when we look at the incidence of this tax expenditure, because I was curious, it's actually page 86 of the tax expenditure report, where you do see just the fact that like this tax expenditure only goes to some of the richest Minnesotans. And, so I really appreciate that the TERC has recommended us modifying this tax expenditure, which should help all married Minnesotans. So page 86.
Great. Thank you, Representative Lee. All right. I think that's good for that part. Thank you very much, Ms. Holterman Rosas. And Mr. Wareka, you're just up there for the duration, from what I can tell. Thomas Rainey, welcome to the committee. Please introduce yourself as you get started.
Madam Chair and members, for the record, my name is Thomas Rainey. I'm a program evaluator with the LBO. For your reference, this tax expenditure evaluation can be found in Appendix G of the annual report. So I'll be presenting an overview of the solar energy systems and wind energy conversion system sales tax exemption evaluation. This evaluation was initially presented to the TERC on November 5th of 2025. And to clarify, these are two separate tax expenditures, but we bundled them into one evaluation for efficiencies in the research and evaluation process. So I'll begin with the presentation of the objectives of each tax expenditure, and I'll then provide some brief background information and highlight a couple of key findings. And lastly, I'll walk through each of the 9 components of review as outlined in Minnesota Statute 3.8855, Subdivision 5. The objective of the Solar Energy Systems General Sales and Use Tax Exemption is to incentivize and promote the implementation and utilization of solar energy systems in the state of Minnesota to achieve a greater percentage of renewable energy contributions to the state's electricity fuel generation mix. Similarly, the objective of the Wind Energy Conversion System General Sales and Use Tax Exemption is to incentivize and promote the implementation and utilization of wind energy systems in Minnesota. The exemption is meant to achieve a greater percentage of renewable energy contributions to the state's electricity fuel generation mix. Both objectives were approved and adopted by the Tax Expenditure Review Commission on March 5th of 2024. Solar energy systems are exempt from the sales and use tax. The exemption was enacted in 2005, and the estimated foregone revenue to the state general fund is $10 million for fiscal year 2026. A solar energy system is a set of devices whose primary purpose is to collect solar energy, convert it, and store it for useful purposes, including heating and cooling buildings or other energy-using processes, or to produce generated power by means of collecting, transferring, and converting solar-generated energy. A common example of these devices is a solar panel you might see on a neighbor's rooftop or in their backyard, but there are other types of eligible technologies. For example, a concentrated solar thermal system, which uses mirrors to concentrate and collect sunlight to produce heat, which can then be harnessed to produce other forms of usable energy like electricity. Various configurations of these types of systems exist. In order to receive the upfront exemption, a purchaser is required to fill out Form ST3 Certificate of Exemption made available by the Department of Revenue and provide it to the seller as part of the transaction. Similarly, the wind energy conversion systems tax expenditure is exemption from the sales and use tax. The exemption was enacted in 1992, and the estimated foregone revenue to the state general fund is $12 million for fiscal year 2026. The exemption applies to a complete system, as well as the materials used to manufacture, install, construct, repair, or replace them if the systems are used as an electric power source. Wind energy conversion systems include any device which converts wind energy to a form of usable energy, such as a wind charger, windmill, or wind turbine. As with the solar energy systems exemption, a purchaser is required to fill out Form ST3 Certificate of Exemption to claim this upfront exemption. Excuse me. So we limited the scope of this evaluation to distributed energy resources, defined as systems that are less than 10 megawatts, are interconnected to a distribution system, and operate in parallel with a utility. Systems larger in size are assumed to be captured under the capital equipment tax exemption. This assumption aligns with the tax expenditure budget for the wind energy conversion systems tax expenditure. We applied the same assumption to the solar energy systems tax expenditure following consultation with the Department of Revenue. So this evaluation is mainly focused on small-scale installations, not large solar cell or wind farms. There's more detail to this distinction within the introduction of the report. The one exception to this is an analysis of the state's total electricity fuel generation mix, which leveraged data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration. Within that data, there is no distinction by size for solar or wind-based renewable energy sources. But the data was necessary to address the question of whether contributions of renewable energy resources has grown. Additionally, to the scope of the evaluation, manufacturing, repair, and replacement costs are not included in the evaluation of wind conversion systems, as this information was not readily accessible. The limitations described are to the scope of this evaluation, and they do not necessarily apply to the tax exemptions. Whether an eligible transaction is exempted by these two exemptions or by the capital equipment exemption could be simply a question of taxpayer filing behavior. The last thing I'd like to note in regard to the scope is that this evaluation is designed, as outlined in statute, to be a look back and does not include considerations of the future impacts of changes in federal renewable energy policies passed in H.R. 1. The report briefly outlines a few of those changes in Appendix G, page 44. So the overall proportion of renewable energy contributions to the state's electricity fuel generation mix has increased substantially since 1990. However, we are unable to state the degree to which these two policies influence uptake in renewable energy, as multiple state, federal, and private programs have incentivized the utilization of solar and wind energy systems. We assume that these policies overlap to encourage the uptake of renewable energy. I'll outline these findings in greater detail in the next slides. This graph depicts Minnesota's electricity fuel generation mix from 1990 to 2020. Over the range, wind energy experienced sizable growth, rising from 0% contribution in 1990 to 21% in 2020. reflecting its growing importance in the energy mix. And solar energy, also non-existent in the early years, increased to about 3% share in 2020. Non-wind and non-solar renewables saw a slight decline from 3 to 2% over the range. It's also important to note the change in fossil fuel sources. In 1990, coal was Minnesota's primary energy source, and it contributed just over 65% of total generation. This share has steadily declined to just under 25% in 2020. Natural gas rose from 1% in 1990 to almost 21% by 2020. So overall, these shifts highlight a transition towards renewable energy sources, specifically illustrated by the proportion of energy generated via wind and, to a lesser degree, solar systems. And for context, the proportion of renewable electricity generation is slightly higher in Minnesota than the entire United States. So these maps show the location of solar and wind energy systems across Minnesota's zip codes. The map on the left shows solar energy system installations, and the map on the right show wind energy conversion system installations. On the solar energy installation map, there are just under 38,000 total installations, and the most concentrated zip code will have just under 550 installations. For the wind, there are 440 installations, and the most concentrated zip codes will have 14 total installations. So for a better view of these two maps, I would refer folks to the report, specifically to pages in Appendix G21 and G23 respectively. I just note that the solar sites tend to be more common in areas with a higher population, and the wind sites tend to locate in areas with higher wind speeds, as well as viable siting locations. So these two graphs are intended to give you an idea of the overall uptake in installations of distributed wind and solar energy systems. The graph on the left illustrates the annual added capacity of solar energy systems from 2010 to 2023 by customer type. That is in relation to the utility provider that reports interconnected distributed energy resources to MPUC. Solar installations were minimal until 2016. The primary drive of the sharp uptake in installations are community solar gardens, which account for the majority of added capacity in 2016 through to 2020. And then a graph on the right illustrates the annual added capacity of wind energy systems from 1997 to 2023. There's a significant variation in the frequency at which wind energy systems are installed, and most customers fall within the commercial category, though there was a higher uptake of residential wind systems between 2005 and 2015. The differences between solar and wind in the amount of added capacity each year is likely due to the fact that there are much fewer installations of wind systems than solar. Solar is more affordable and overall more accessible distributed energy system, thus making it a more popular choice among residential customers. So for the remainder of the presentation, I'll provide an overview of our evaluation's findings with respect to the 9 components of review under Minnesota Statute Section 3.8855, Subdivision 5. The first component is annual revenue lost or foregone revenue. And again, the estimated foregone revenue for the solar energy system is $10 million for fiscal year 2026, and the estimated foregone revenue for the wind energy conversion system is $12 million for fiscal year 2026. Estimates of fiscal impact are taken from the 2024 tax expenditure budget published by the Department of Revenue Tax Research. Again, both objectives were approved and adopted by the Tax Expenditure Review Commission on March 15th of 2024 for the purposes of evaluating the solar energy systems and wind energy conversion system sales tax exemptions. Both objectives pertain to incentivizing and promoting the implementation and utilization of both energy systems to achieve a greater percentage of renewable energy contributions to the state's electricity fuel generation mix. The third component of review is measuring the impact and efficiency in accomplishing the objectives. So this evaluation determines that both sales tax expenditures have likely met their objectives. So that is to say, the implementation and utilization of these systems has increased, and both types of systems make up a greater proportion of the state's electricity generation mix, though this is likely due to the broader policy initiative, including other state and federal initiatives along with these exemptions and the overall decrease in cost of these systems. But we cannot isolate the direct impacts of these tax expenditures as standalone policies. Estimating the measurable impacts and efficiency of the two tax expenditures accomplishing their respective objectives is complicated for several reasons. First, due to the complexity of the renewable energy policy area, it is difficult to empirically assess the measurable impact of one specific piece of renewable energy policy. For example, multiple state, federal, and private programs incentivize the utilization of wind and solar energy systems, making it difficult to parse out the impact of a specific policy. Thus, we assume that these policies overlap to encourage the uptake of renewable energy. And second, there are significant data limitations that inhibit the ability of the LBO to conduct a comparative analysis at the level required to estimate the measurable impacts of a single tax expenditure. Additionally, the levelized cost of renewable energy has decreased independent from government subsidies, and the levelized cost refers to the cost of a fuel source per unit over the assumed lifetime of that fuel's production system. So this allows for a comparison between different technologies. All of this is to say that the objectives outcomes have been achieved to some degree, but we cannot isolate the direct impacts of these two specific tax expenditures. A component of review number 4 is a comparison to a direct expenditure with the same objective. And an alternate to an upfront sales tax exemption is a direct payment incentive like a grant or a loan. There are key differences between each policy design that are worth noting. It can be argued that a tax exemption has the potential to reach a larger population based on the assumption that it is less administratively burdensome to obtain and it is not capped at a certain dollar amount. However, the benefit per entity is likely to be smaller in comparison to a grant or loan program. An advantage of a direct payment incentive is that is likely to address financial barriers for targeted populations who would otherwise not be in a position to participate in a particular activity. And an underlying assumption here is that the benefit per entity is much larger than the benefit of a sales tax exemption. Additionally, there is a potential for the participant pool to be smaller based on either the eligibility criteria necessary to target a specific group or financial resource limitations associated with direct expenditure programs. Potential modifications to increase efficiency or effectiveness. We did not identify any potential modifications to increase efficiency or effectiveness. Sales tax exemptions are an inherently administratively efficient type of tax expenditure. In terms of the revenue neutral rate reduction, the Minnesota Department of Revenue Tax Research calculated a revenue neutral rate that would reduce the current state sales tax rate from 6.875% to 6.866% for the wind energy conversion systems exemption and from 6.875% to 6.868% for the solar energy system exemption. Each revenue neutral rate was calculated in isolation of each other. Tax incidence refers to who ultimately bears the relative burden of a tax that is levied. The incidence analysis is not available for wind energy conversion systems or solar energy system sales and use tax exemptions. The Department of Revenue assumes that the incidence of both exemptions is similar to the incidence of the business sales tax. A brief analysis of the incidence of the business sales tax is provided in this report based on an incidence breakdown found in the 2024 tax expenditure budget. Based on claims of the residential clean energy credit at the federal level, the LBO estimates that 67% of the value of these exemptions is realized by households with adjusted gross income in the top 24%. Component 8 is the cumulative fiscal impact of other state and federal policies. The cumulative fiscal impact of other state and federal taxes providing benefits to taxpayers for similar activities in calendar year 2023 are about $77 million for solar and roughly $1.3 million for wind. The estimates include the Minnesota Solar Energy Production Incentive Program, the federal residential clean energy credits, and federal grants under the Rural Energy for America program. The estimate of fiscal impact are not comprehensive of all available programs given data limitations. Examples of programs not included in these estimates are incentive programs offered by utility providers and federal exclusions from income on utility-provided subsidies. The last component of review is a recommendation from the Tax Expenditure Review Commission to the legislature to continue, repeal, or modify the policy. As my colleague mentioned in the annual report presentation, the commission voted to recommend a modification, and the details of that will be included in the 2026 annual report. I would defer to members of the commission to answer questions regarding the details of those recommendations. And for the sake of time, we are not covering the appendix slides during this presentation, but they have been made available for your reference, and we're happy to provide any discussion or follow-up for members. Thank you for your time.
Great, thank you, Mr. Rainey. Moving to member questions and discussion. Chair Joachim.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. And just out of curiosity, a quick question on the chart that you had for solar or wind on annual added capacity by customer type. Under commercial, I know that a few of the cities I represent have invested in solar on top of some of our municipal buildings. Would that be under the commercial tag on, because commercial kind of really went up between 22 and 23, and I was just wondering if a municipal building would be under that commercial piece.
Mr. Rainey.
Yeah, Chair Gomez and Representative, I would assume so, but I would like to take a look at the metadata to confirm that. So we'll reach out to you and just confirm that.
Great, thank you. Chair Swedzinski.
Hey, thank you, Madam Chair. I think, and in addition, for any of those public projects, I think to some extent, because they're a sales tax exempt entity when they're purchasing, so they probably have some exemptions other than this.
Nice to have our energy chair on our tax committee. Thank you, Chair. Any other conversation? All right, not seeing any. Thank you, Mr. Rainey. Is there anybody else have anything to say generally? Representative Agbaje.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the committee for your time, for hearing the work that the TERC has been doing over the past year. It has been a pleasure to work with the LBO staff, so I just want to say thank you to them in front of everyone again for your hard work and for getting us a lot of answers to our questions, some very detailed questions that sometimes we don't actually have the ability to get. But I am hoping as the TERC moves forward that we can continue to work on ways to ensure that we have better access to data, that we're using more data to be able to understand the economic impacts of the work that we're doing here in the legislature. I think overall I'll just say is that as we started this year, we moved into the recommendations portion of the TERC's mandate and objectives. And so, we'll keep refining that. We kind of developed a system that we thought would work for us in the immediate sense. But we know that there's probably more work to do there. Overall, though, I would just like to say that it has been a good forum for discussion on terms of about like the principles of these tax expenditures and are they actually meeting the objectives we want them to meet. And I'm hoping that that continues. I think the hardest part will be figuring out what way is the best recommendation. As you saw in the first three, we kind of defaulted to the modification, which I think is helpful in these ones because there were definitely a number of issues and practicalities that needed to be addressed with these certain tax expenditures. But I am hoping over time that we can start to come to a consensus around whether a repeal or a continuation actually makes more sense. Or if we continue on the modification route, that in future reports you'll see exactly the types of modifications that we would recommend to the legislature. So with that, I'll leave it there, but if anyone has any questions or is interested in joining us, and if you're coming back in 27, please let me know, so.
All right, thank you, Chair Agbaje. We'll go to, is there anybody else who has anything? Yes, Representative Smith.
Sorry, I didn't mean to go after the chair of TERC. One of the many chairs that we have of TERC. Echoing thanks to staff who worked on this in a variety of departments and offices. It really is an incredible resource, and I know it's very thick, but I would recommend folks to look through the report. It's incredibly helpful. I just wanted to give voice to something that we just weren't able to cover today. TERC covers a wide array of things. The commission did, a University of Georgia report on data center equipment tax expenditure and evaluation of that. I think that was in our January meeting, if I'm remembering correctly. I would just encourage members of this committee to look at that report. It's very thorough. It goes through a lot of different aspects of our data center equipment exemption, how it could be improved. I did want to point out that the report does conclude that the projected overall ROI is something around negative 0.02, so we get about 98 cents back for every dollar we spend on that particular exemption. There's a lot more details around that, of course, that require discussion, but I think it's really worthwhile to look at that report. So I just wanted to bring attention to that and make sure that folks on the committee knew about that and would go check that out on their own. If you need help finding it, sometimes the tax expenditure website is a little hard to navigate. Feel free to ask staff or me, but I would love everyone to check that out. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Representative Smith. Maybe we'll see if we can just send that out to everybody on the committee so that you have it for your reference. Anybody else? Yeah, we'll go to Chair Davids in just a second. I just wanted to say that we also have the tax expenditure budget is coming out this year, the new one. I'm looking at the department. November, not till November. This is just such an incredible resource. I hope that members of the committee use it. I hope that members of the legislature use it. Joe Bagnoli's here. He told me when they announced that I was tax chair, he was like, I saw you your first year with that tax expenditure budget under your arm, and it was full of Post-it notes, and it was dog-eared, and that's when I knew you had the tax sickness. So if anybody else wants to get the tax sickness, it's a good entree into just the fascinating breadth of topics that we cover in this committee. So looking forward to that. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate your points from earlier. And I want to thank you for all your work on the committee in the past, and Representative Joy for his work. This is work we take very, very seriously. And to work with Chair Agbaje, who does just a wonderful job on this committee. And I want to thank Representative Robbins and my neighbor to the north, Representative Smith, and that was a pretty fascinating presentation to me at the University of Georgia, coming in and going through that, because that's something I pay very close attention to. And also to thank Joanna Bears, thank Commissioner Marquardt. Commissioner Marquardt's at every meeting and gives us very good input. And to the staff, the TERC staff sitting over here, thank you for all the work you've done. So this is serious business, and as you mentioned earlier, it's a lot of money that's directed by what this legislature does. And so I'm really excited about the attention the last few years that we have put forward from members of the tax committee into this committee. I think it's very important. I'll just conclude saying we are a pretty big deal.
We are indeed, Mr. Chair. Also, hey, Mr. Chair, you have the gavel next on Tuesday, March 3rd. How is it March already? March 3rd, 2026. That happened. What can we look forward to?
I'm not sure how we're going to be in March next week, but the bills, not necessarily in this order, House File 3127, the pass-through entities. I think that's very important to go over that. And then we have two Robbins bills, House File 3525. The issue of no tax on tips, 3524, Robbins no tax on overtime. And then House File XXX, we don't have a number yet, Representative Joyce, the Trump accounts. And then Thursday, we may be looking at more on federal conformity. So we've got a good busy week next week, and then whatever you're going to do on Wednesday will be awesome.
Sounds good. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Seeing nothing else for the good of the order, see everybody Tuesday. We are adjourned.
Thanks, Chair Gomez. Thank you.